Today, it is commonplace to work Greenland or the Antarctica. They are just another country for your DXCC list. But this wasn't so in the early 20s. For some, Station WNP of the Macmillan expeditions was the ultimate in DX. Dr. Macmillan made several expeditions to the north during the 20s and on each occasion had an amateur operator for communication. One of the best known was Don Mix, 1TS, who was a long-time ARRL staff member. Here is equipment for one of the expeditions provided by Zenith. At left is Fred Snell of transatlantic fame, then Don Mix, followed by QST editor KB Warner, then Zenith engineer MB West, and at the far right, the leader of the expedition, Dr. Macmillan. Don was an excellent operator and proved himself by maintaining contact with American, Canadian amateurs frequently under adverse conditions. QST carried a running record of the expedition's progress. Many amateurs made headlines, such as Canadian 9BP and our old friend Roland Bourne, 1ANA. Note that at this time the amateur was operating on 200 meters. The Zenith Company provided entertainment and personal messages to early expeditions through their broadcast station, WJAZ. The broadcasts were frequently started by calling in code. And here is the actual omnograph that was used for this purpose. Let us listen to it. A Zenith receiver. All early receivers were, of course, of the regenerative type, although in time some stations started to use Armstrong's Super Het. Little of this early equipment was saved. Here, however, is a transmitter-receiver combination I recently photographed that was used on the 1925 expedition. The 3-tube regenerative receiver is at left with transmitter at right. Note the coils. By the mid-20s, they were all on shortwave. The later BYRD expeditions to the Antarctica provided a challenge to the DXer. I worked KC-4USA several times before the war on 20-meter AM phone. What was then rare is now considered commonplace, for several countries now have land-based stations in the Antarctica. The polar regions have always held a certain fascination, and the National Geographic magazine provided excellent coverage. BYRD, like Macmillan, had great praise for the radio amateur. Let us visit an amateur who has had much experience in the polar regions, Bud WAITE, W2ZK. Fortunately, Bud was also an amateur photographer and had recorded his 35 years in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. W2ZK has rather an impressive record to his credit. Arrangements were made, and I drove to his Oceanport, New Jersey home, where he was waiting for me. A friendly greeting, and we were immediately talking about his experiences. At my request, he brought out some of his souvenirs. It has all been quite rewarding, hasn't it, Bud?
Yes, Bruce. If you've been in any one of these businesses like these adventures of ours long enough, you're bound to collect a few medals.
He had also saved a parka, which I asked him to put on for a picture. He was a little reluctant, for it was rather warm outside. Now, Bud, show us some of your pictures and tell us about the Antarctic as you remember it.
As it happens, the Antarctic continent is 5.25 million square miles in extent, and this map shows the United States superimposed on it to give you some idea of the comparative size. The Antarctic is covered with a sheet of ice that varies in thickness from 300 to about 14,000 feet, as recently measured by some of the radio ice depth sounding gear that I happened to be lucky enough to develop during the latter years of my working period. As you probably know, I retired 10 years ago. All expeditions start from some port on the east or west coast of the United States. This is the east wind leaving Boston. Our relatives in there, along with Admiral Byrd and his friends, saying goodbye to us on one of the more recent ones. The icebreaker leads the way down the coast, the convoy following along behind. When we get through the Panama Canal and start bucking the big waves of the Pacific, these bathtub icebreakers roll like old whales. They roll sometimes up to 55 degrees. Here the bow of the east wind is diving into a wave, the hawsepipe covers have come off, and the starboard boom has crashed down on a gun tub, and it's really rough. Even the dogs get seasick in their little 3-by-4 foot square houses on deck. In spite of the wind and waves and punishment that they take ordinarily, they're really seasick when it gets rough. Look at this one. Pathetic creature. Notice the blue eyes. We breed them this way so that they'll have more resistance to snow blindness when they get out there over the great stretches of white ice. And eventually we reach Port Lyttelton, the harbor of the great town of Christchurch, New Zealand, where our expeditions rendezvous nowadays. And our first visit is to the famous monument to the more famous Sir Robert Falcon Scott, the second man to reach the South Pole, following in the footsteps of Roald Amundsen of Norway, back there in 1912.